brass band, I'd set it on a mountain, and a symphony of horns would roll across.
Cynthia Hopkins is a distinctively special music theater maker. She has an innate theatrical uniqueness and power.
This show, it kind of uses as my story of coming of age and being able to address issues outside of my psychodrama as a metaphor for my species, the human race.
And I suddenly realize that alcoholism is an excellent metaphor for the climate crisis. We're addicted to behavior that is making us sick.
It is a piece called This Clement World, and it's Cynthia meditating on the state of the world and climate change and global warming. And she equates that to her own challenges around alcoholism in her earlier years.
But in the Arctic, it's impossible not to notice that we're actually lucky to have survived thus far.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
Hi, my name's Ashley Duffalo, and I'm the Public and Community Programs Manager here at the Walker. And I'm absolutely delighted to see all of you here tonight. I've been eagerly anticipating this program for quite some time now. The trailer you just saw gives you a little preview of what to anticipate tonight. Special guest, musical performance artist Cynthia Hopkins is going to speak and also perform a bit and give us kind of a background story to the evolution of this Clement World. So now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Patrick Hamilton is the Director of Global Change Initiatives at the Science Museum of Minnesota and leads the Future Earth Project, a National Science Foundation-supported set of exhibits and programs. He is also the Principal Investigator with the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics, a Fellow for the Institute of the Environment, and a member of the Board for District Energy St. Paul. Peter Snyder is an atmospheric scientist and professor in the University of Minnesota's Department of Soil, Water, and Climate. He studies an array of problems related to atmospheric physics, land-atmosphere interactions, and climate change, with research spanning the Arctic, the tropics, and North America. Cynthia Hopkins, a purveyor of outlandishly theatrical fictions and original avant-folk orchestral songs, is an audaciously charismatic talent that fans will follow anywhere, from memoir, murder, and memory loss in the South to 70s pop stardom, the CIA, the Moroccan Sufism, to evolution in outer space. All have figured in her trilogy of previous works at the Walker. In This Clement World, Hopkins grapples with the environmental crisis with her most expansive show to date. Considered a breathtaking visionary by Time Out New York, Hopkins' multimedia performances blur the lines between edification and entertainment. She is a recipient of an Alpert Award in theater and a Guggenheim Fellowship. And all of these speakers will be taking the stage individually to speak roughly 10 minutes, and then will be called upon for a conversation, which will be moderated by Paul Douglas. Paul is a nationally respected meteorologist with 33 years of television and radio experience, and the author of On Weather for the Star Tribune. He is a serial entrepreneur, founding Weather Nation, Meteorologic Group, Smart Energy, and other companies. Douglas, a Republican, has been outspoken in explaining that acknowledging evidence of a growing human influence on climate, quote, doesn't make you a liberal. Please help me in welcoming Pat Hamilton to the stage.
Thank you, Cynthia. You know, I can't think of a topic that would benefit more from the heavy lifting of art and science than climate change. And so I deeply admire Cynthia Hopkins for bringing her art to an issue that deeply needs her expertise. And I appreciate Peter Snyder for advancing the science of climate, which we all will benefit from. And Paul Douglas, as a professional meteorologist, has been outspoken on the issue of climate change for many years. So what am I doing here? Well, one of my colleagues at the Science Museum of Minnesota says that we serve as competent outsiders. And so to elaborate on that, let me talk about the Future Earth. Future Earth is a suite of exhibits and programs at the Science Museum predicated around the idea that we now live on a human-dominated planet. How do we survive and thrive on a human-dominated planet? We started developing this project about 4 years ago, but with the benefit of perfect 2020 hindsight, the seed for this project actually was planted back in 2001. And that's when I got a phone call from Effie Fufala at the University of Minnesota. She and her 2 colleagues pictured there were writing a multi-million-dollar, multi-institutional, multi-year grant to the National Science Foundation. And they asked, would the Science Museum like to be a partner? And we said, absolutely. But if you're going to write a big proposal like that, you better have a big idea. And they did, which is that rivers are absolutely essential to the economic, physical, cultural, social, and spiritual vitality of literally billions of people on this planet. And geologists and engineers and ecologists have been studying rivers for years, decades, centuries. But those individual silos of knowledge had not coalesced into a more complete understanding of rivers, to the detriment of rivers and to everyone who depends on them. So they submitted a proposal to create a new synthetic science that would bring all these disciplines together to create a more complete understanding. As you can imagine, a proposal of that scale gets a lot of scrutiny, many, many months of review. I call it the NSF spanking machine. But they got through it. And in 2002, the National Center for Earth Surface Dynamics was established, and I got to be one of the PIs, but I'm not a scientist. My responsibility was to work with this team and work on ways that we could communicate what they're doing to larger public audiences. And it has been a great gig. I've got to travel with them, eat with them, drink with them, visit their research sites. And it occurred to me several years ago that I was hearing the same story, different versions of the same story from all of them. The geomorphologists were telling me humans are now the dominant agent of landscape change on the planet. The sedimentologists were telling me that humans now are responsible for moving more earth and rock on this planet than all rivers and glaciers on the planet combined. And the ecologists were telling me that it's no longer possible to study an ecosystem on the surface of this planet without taking into account human influences. So I got up in front of them several years ago and I said, it seems like what you're telling me is that humans are now the dominant agent of change on the planet. And I expected pushback. I expected someone to say, that's not nuanced enough. But the room was rather quiet, and finally one of the geoscientists said, well, you know, that's been the topic of conversation in the geoscience community for some time now. And I said, well, that's interesting because I don't think that's how the vast majority of people relate to the planet around them. So I wrote a proposal to the National Science Foundation, and it too went through the NSF spanking machine, but it made it through. And in 2009, we started developing a project called Future Earth based on 3 premises. We dominate the planet, we have tremendous assets, and we need to innovate, and we need to innovate now. There are actually many ways in which humans now surpass natural processes on this planet, but I just want to briefly mention 3. Land, the 21% of the globe that's covered in land, the 71% that's covered with ocean, and the atmosphere that encompasses the entire planet. So first up, the land. So this visualization created by the Institute on the Environment at the University of Minnesota, everything in green is cropland. This is the land we would grow our corn, soybean, rice, sorghum. If you take all that land on the planet and concentrate it on one continent, it'd be the size of South America. And then, of course, we graze animals. And if you take all the land on the planet that's devoted to grazing animals and pasture, It's equivalent to an area the size of Africa. So right now on this planet, we use 40% of all the ice-free land in the world to grow our crops and raise our livestock. And there's 7 billion of us now, and there's 2 billion more expected in the year 2050. So if you look at the ocean, it's easy to think of the ocean as being remote from our lives, particularly when we live in the center of a continent. But the ocean is no longer free from human influence anywhere on this planet. If you take a look at the cumulative impacts of fishing, fossil fuel extraction, shipping, pollutants flowing into oceans from rivers, we affect the entire global ocean. But the most pervasive way in which we are altering the ocean is actually through the burning of fossil fuels. So we're taking carbon out of the ground in the form of oil, coal, and gas, and we combine it with oxygen. We burn it to make heat and light, energy. And then we allow the carbon dioxide to freely go off into the atmosphere. Now, the oceanographers tell me that's a good news, bad news story. The good news is about 20 to 25% of the carbon dioxide humans are releasing is dissolving into the global ocean. And that is slowing the rate of climate change that we would have seen otherwise. But the bad news is you take carbon dioxide and water and you combine them together and you get a chemical reaction and forms carbonic acid. So we are in the process right now of lowering the pH and increasing the acidity of the entire global ocean. A process, I submit, we cannot allow to incur indefinitely. And then finally, the ocean. We've known since the 19th century that carbon dioxide traps heat into the atmosphere. And nowadays, it's not a matter of if climate change is going to happen, but where, when, or by how much. Last September, you probably saw news articles and heard news stories about the rapid decrease in aerial extent of sea ice, that sea ice had reached a new minimum. What was less reported is that the actual volume of ice is also decreasing rapidly. What this visualization shows is 25 years of Arctic sea ice, and the white is old ice that's many years old, it may be several meters thick, and it is melting away particularly rapidly. And two things alarm me about this. One of them is that there wasn't a climate model in the world that predicted this would happen as rapidly as it has. And the other thing that concerns me is that now every year there's a tremendous amount of energy going into the Arctic Ocean and atmosphere that decades past was reflected back into space. Now, what is going to happen with this tremendous amount of additional heat energy in the Earth system is a very difficult computational problem. But at its most simplest level, the atmosphere is a heat engine. And if you add more heat to a heat engine, it will begin to behave differently. And I submit that we're starting to see changes in how the atmosphere behaves that are discernible not only by scientists, but all of us living on the planet today. So we are changing the planet that we live on, but we are also changing ourselves. So this is your planet on Facebook. This is not Facebook mapped onto a map of the Earth. This is what happened when you plot all the Facebook connections around the planet. You actually outlined continents and countries, with the exception, of course, of China, which doesn't allow Facebook. 1 in 3 people on this planet now have access to the internet, the global brain. Cellular mobile cell phone subscriptions. There are now 6 billion mobile cellular phone subscriptions in the world, and there are 7 billion people. In a few short years, I suspect that virtually no one on this planet will not have access to a cell phone. There are 400 million college graduates on this planet, comparable to the population of the United States and Mexico combined. We now live in a world home to the healthiest, wealthiest, best educated, most peaceful, influential, innovative, and connected populace ever. So we need to innovate in all sorts of ways, economically, politically, technologically, socially. And I just want to give you just one example. And I'm going to use the example of buildings, because buildings are responsible for consuming 40% of all the energy used in the United States on an annual basis. So they have a big, big environmental footprint. And so here is your one and only multiple choice question of the evening. We had an energy analysis done of the Science Museum's building a few years ago. And according to that analysis, the Science Museum could reduce its purchases of heat energy by how much? By implementing the recommendations of this analysis. So I'm not asking for a show of hands. You can just think about it. Do you think it's A, 10%, B, 30, C, 50, D, 70, or E, 90%? It's 90%. It's a 13-year-old building, and we can reduce its consumption of heat energy by 90%. So actually, how many picked F? Or was it E? Excuse me, E, 90%. F, none of the above. Oh, good for you. Good for you. It's not as surprising as I thought it was when we discovered this. So we are actually in the process right now of signing the contracts, ordering the equipment, to have this system in place by October 1st. And it's not so important, I think, that the Science Museum do this. What's important is that imagine the economic, employment, and environmental opportunities if energy-efficient buildings were not rare, but commonplace. So we dominate the planet. We now surpass natural processes in creating change. We now live in a world that is home to the healthiest, wealthiest, best educated, most innovative, creative, connected populace ever. But we must innovate, and we must do it now. And the future is going to be decided by human decision-making, either by default or by design. So I encourage you to think of what the future Earth is that you want. Thank you.
Good evening. I just want to thank the Walker and Ashley, of course, and my colleagues down here at the front. I'm way out of my league here. I am a scientist. So I'm not going to be as smooth as Paul or Pat and as musical. You don't want to hear me sing as Cynthia. But I want to talk to you a little bit about climate change from my perspective as an atmospheric scientist. And I want to try to convince you, if you're not entirely sure about the idea of climate change, about whether it has a connection to people in Minnesota. And I'll get to that point in a second. But let's look at the facts from an atmospheric science perspective. From an atmospheric science perspective, we really care about the Arctic because we know the Arctic is warming at about twice the rate of the planet as a whole. We see this every year in the climate record from our measurement stations, from our satellites, and whatnot. There are two lines of evidence that this is occurring. One is we can see changes occurring over the land surface, and then the second line of evidence is in sea ice. Which Pat had alluded to in the previous talk. That's from an atmospheric science perspective. And when the land surface changes, it changes the way the solar radiation, the sun's rays, what they do. We get a lot of snow in the Arctic. We have a lot of ice in the Arctic. And that stuff is really good at reflecting the solar radiation out to space. But we are seeing more and more changes to the shape. We're losing sea ice in the Arctic. It's changing the reflectivity, and we cause this. This causes an amplification or a warming, and this warming then runs out of control. And this is what we're dealing with right now. But you know, I give a lot of talks to people in Minnesota, and one of the things that always comes up is why should we really care about this? It's very difficult for a lot of people, probably not the people who are in this room tonight, but a lot of people to think about the polar bear and the plight of the polar bear. This iconic image is what we think about when we think about climate change. But you know, when we go to the end of the day, this is what we're really dealing with on our daily basis. We're thinking about all of our issues down here, and we're not really focused on that polar bear and the types of changes. Climate change down here is not nearly as strong as it is in the Arctic. And so sometimes it's difficult to be thinking about it. So what I would like to do now is to take you on a little story, a little journey from a scientific perspective about how what's going on in the Arctic may in fact be influencing us down here. I also went through the spanking machine many times, as Pat has alluded to. In 2007, I embarked on a 5-year project with the National Science Foundation to study climate change in the Arctic. And in 2007, I took a trip up the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, the haul road that you might have seen in ice road truckers, up from Fairbanks, Alaska to Prudhoe Bay. And I must say it's probably the worst road I've ever been on in my life, but the trucks do it just fine, back and forth day and night. So we had this Ford Taurus with truck tires on it and a CB in it, and we drove up the haul road. And you get to some beautiful, beautiful scenery that very few people have ever seen. The North Slope of Alaska is one of the most amazing tundra grassland environments with a gorgeous mountain range in the back of it. And it's just a really, really nice view and well worth going to if you have a chance in your life to go up and see it. I was up there, one thing we were interested in doing was knowing how the landscape was changing with all this warming that is occurring on the planet. And fortunately, in the 1950s, the oil companies went up to Alaska and took lots of photos to try to identify where the petroleum might be. And we can go back to those locations and take photographs of from the same vantage point. And when you do that, we start to see changes in the vegetation structure, and we're seeing more, less reflective vegetation that is absorbing more of the sun's rays and warming the environment further. And so there's a lot of evidence showing that this is occurring not only in Alaska, but throughout the Arctic on all the continents. When you do travel up the haul road, you'll come to one of the ugliest places, which is Prudhoe Bay, which is the oil fields and the operations center. Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay are the operations center for British Petroleum and ConocoPhillips and Halliburton, which are running the oil fields up there. And it's a very, very nasty place, but if you're ever interested in seeing polar bears up there, I recommend you go to the dump at Prudhoe Bay. You can guarantee you'll see them there. We went out to the Arctic Ocean, which was part of my other research, which was focused on sea ice and what was going on. And we were very disappointed in 2007 to see this image, which was the Arctic Ocean. It's a very uninspiring coastline, but the fact was there was no sea ice at all that time. And this is what the image looked like. If you see, Alaska is over there on the upper left side, and Prudhoe Bay that time of year was ice-free in 2007. And on the right, you can see what it looked like in 1981, going back to an early part of the satellite record. And this is showing you the fraction of ice cover. I'm going to show you what it looked like at the end of the ice season. So it starts to refreeze sometimes around the end of August or into early September. And this is what it looked like with a very large open area of Arctic Ocean up there. And this is absorbing a lot of the sun's rays because it's less reflective than the ice that would normally be there in the wintertime. If we watch this animation, this will take you through the 2007 season. And I think it's just a really powerful animation because it shows you the sort of dynamics that are going on and the seriousness of this problem with a lot of Arctic Ocean that's open. And the interesting thing with climate change and Arctic sea ice loss is that it's not just about the warming. There's also things going on in the ocean and the ocean dynamics which are also changing, as Pat also alluded to. And you can really see the Arctic flushing through the Canadian archipelago with sea ice being broken up and exported out of the Arctic Ocean, as well as the Beaufort Gyre, which is off of Alaska. This is the image of what we had to deal with in 2007. So we were already seeing decreases over a long-term average, but now we're really seeing them decrease in 2007 by the heart of the summer season. And the ice never really recovers very well from that. We know that because in 2012 we've had the worst loss of sea ice that we've ever had in the Arctic Ocean. And I will guarantee you that in the next several years, we will have a curve on here that will exceed what 2012 had, because physics says it's so. If you watch this animation here, this is showing you what the September, which would be when the ice is at its minimum, was doing over the satellite record from around 1980 to the present. And as we get in particular into the 2000s, around that time period, that's where the sea ice loss is starting to really accelerate. We can really see the open sea ice, particularly around Alaska and around Siberia. It's getting quite small. As Pat also alluded to from his animation, the problem with this is when you melt sea ice, when it does refreeze in the wintertime, it starts over from a thinner layer and you have less ice available. So that following season, when summer comes along, you have less that you need to melt to get rid of the ice. And that is why I'm telling you from a physics standpoint, we will be losing more and more and more sea ice as we continue. Current estimates are that we will be ice-free in the summertime probably by around 2020, if not 2025 in that time frame. So not very long from now. Most of you will be here to see that. This is what the anomalies of temperature were. And while it's easy to focus on North America, we had a ridiculous weather this last year, breaking records left and right. The Arctic is what I want you to focus on, which is that very extreme warming. A lot of that is related to that loss of sea ice. So the whole Arctic region is warming much more than the rest of the planet, and that has very important consequences. A lot of you fly around the country and you encounter the jet stream. The jet stream is driven by the gradient or the change in temperature from the equator to the poles. And the weaker that gradient is with all that warming in the Arctic, it slows down the jet stream. And when it slows down the jet stream, there's physics, and there's an equation there, and those are the dynamics that we use to explain atmospheric motion. That equation says that we can expect a more wavy jet stream and a slower movement of those troughs and those ridges of that jet stream because of the warming in the Arctic. And because our mid-latitude weather systems are riding along the jet stream, they're directly coupled to it, they can have an impact on our weather. And in fact, we had some very weird weather in March of 2012. Most of you probably remember the absolutely pleasant 80 degrees that we had in March. We had a string of 10 days in the 60s, 70s, and then we hit 80. This weird pattern with this big trough that goes over the central part of the United States, we were just to the east of that trough, and we had weather, we had temperatures in Winnipeg that were warmer than they were in Phoenix because of the waviness of this jet stream. Now, in 2012, we also had the Duluth, Minnesota floods. We had about 10 inches or 9 inches of rain in about 30 hours. It did a lot of damage over a very short time period. Now, as a climate scientist, I never equate one weather event to climate change. We must, as proper stewards of our field, recognize the statistics of this, and we need to have evidence that this is a trend or it's changing. And so this is suggestive of the kinds of long duration, very heavy rain events that we're starting to see more and more in Minnesota. But in Duluth, it's a 1,000-year flood event, which means it should come back every 1,000 years. But if we have another one of these in under 1,000 years, then we should potentially be concerned. Now, that's one event. If you go to southern Minnesota, this is a different story. Over the last 8 years, we have had 3,000-year flood events. For those of you who are familiar with those events, some of them upwards of 13 or 14 inches of rain in under 48 hours. So this is a little bit more of a scary situation. And this is what we're really focused on, is extreme heavy rain events that will impact you here. So when you're thinking about that polar bear, maybe perhaps that polar bear and the plight of that polar bear is very similar to the plight that you may be facing as our infrastructure doesn't meet the needs of climate change. So with that, I'm going to end and just say thank you. And I've enjoyed this talk with you guys tonight.
Hi. It's a real honor to be here, and it's so fascinating to hear you guys talk. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do in general and what I've done with this particular piece, and then I'll perform a little tiny segment from the piece, and then we'll get into a conversation. So generally, I work from disturbance. So whatever disturbs me the most at any given time becomes the subject of my work. So my work is a survival technique. It's to keep me from jumping off of a bridge or a tall building, or drinking myself to death, which would probably be my preferred method. So the disturbance of climate change is obviously it's quite a disturbing topic for any human being to encounter. For me, it came to the front burner of my disturbance stove because of a couple of really lucky chance occurrences. So I also invite chance into my work and into my life. And in this case, I was invited to a conference organized by Tipping Point, which is a British organization that fosters dialogue about climate change by organizing conferences for climate scientists and artists. The idea is that maybe artists would be inspired to make work about this issue and communicate about it in a way that journalists and scientists don't do. So the very opening speech of that conference was by a climate scientist named Wallace Broecker, and I'm actually going to perform the song that I wrote basically for him to sing, and this fictional character will explain to you sort of why a little bit in a minute. So I won't talk too much about it, but I will say that it really blew my mind because he went up there. He's an older gentleman in his late 70s, and he's been studying climate science his whole life. And what he said was, I wish I could live a little longer because what happens next to this planet and this species is going to be determined by what we do next. And it could go any number of ways. And I'm really curious to see what's going to happen. And I was so moved by that. And so I wrote this song for him to sing that expresses that sentiment. And he basically said we're at a turning point in human history. So the next day, a guy named Jeffrey Sachs, who writes about sustainability, gave a talk, and an artist in the audience said, what can an artist possibly do about this subject matter? And he said, you can communicate in a different way, like I just was saying. You can kind of translate this information from this type of communication to a different kind that might be more visceral or more narrative or more emotional. And that's basically what I do in my work in general, is what I take a disturbance and I do research, and then I learn as much about it as I can, and then I kind of like, I use the word alchemize. You know, alchemy is like turns base metals into gold by the injection of a philosopher's stone, this mystical thing that nobody ever could find. And so my process is I take these disturbances and I kind of inject fiction and music and the imagination into them. And what I hope emerges is works that inspire and inspire people, myself included, with hope. So it's like a transference of disturbance into hope is what I'm trying to do. And And then the second thing that lucky thing that happened to me was that I was invited on an Arctic expedition just a couple months after the Tipping Point Conference, and by another British organization called Cape Farewell, which has basically the same mission as Tipping Point, but instead of holding conferences, they bring artists and scientists on Arctic expeditions. And so I don't have time to sort of go into it. You can come see the show, because basically the show tells the story of that journey from my idiosyncratic perspective, which is that of an alcoholic and drug addict in recovery. So I wake up every day an alcoholic and drug addict in recovery. And so that's part of my lens through which I see the world. And so when I started to learn about what's happening, it reminded me the way we're scrounging around in the dirt for fossil fuels, which we're learning are kind of destroying the habitability of our planet, is similar to what I used to do, which is scrounge around in the drug drawer for drugs that were destroying my life. So there's that kind of narrative, prosaic travel log of this journey, and then it's interspliced by commentary from wildly fictional characters who have a much wider perspective on the situation. So the piece shuttles between this tiny little perspective that is me in this little human body with my little alcoholic mind, my little tiny lifetime that's not going to last nearly as long as the CO2 emissions that I'm putting into the air. And then it shuttles between that and these really wider perspectives. One is a ghost of a Native American who was slaughtered 200 years ago. One is from outer space, and that's the guy that I'm going to do for you in a second. And then the third is a visitor from the future, from 200 years in the future. So I think that's all I sort of need to say about the piece, and I'll just transition into this dude from outer space. So the only thing you need to know, I'm going to do from the very end of the piece, and so you've met him before. You have to imagine that you've met him earlier in the evening, and that he's already explained that he's in disguise as an amiable dude, a fairly amiable dude. And the reason, so I'm getting into his ensemble now. So, and he's wearing whatever the local hat is, he's wearing to make people feel comfortable. And not, too freaked out by him. And basically, he says, if you could see what I really look like, you would not listen to what I have to say. So I've made an effort to appear to you as a fairly amiable dude, and he kind of talks in a way that makes you comfortable. And so I'm going to move over here to the microphone for you guys up there in the land of lights and sound. And maybe that's all you need to know about him. I think so. He calls, you've been watching this documentary about the boat trip the whole time, and he calls it a picture show. And if I think of something else you need to know, I'll just say it. So let's imagine that the lady on the boat, she gets home from her Arctic trip, and she starts to make a documentary about it. And she's trying to tell a story she do not know how to tell. So she proposes a metaphor comparing her alcoholism and drug addiction to her society's addiction to fossil fuels. And people scrounging around in the dirt for the fuels reminds her of scrounging around in the drug drawer for the drugs. But the thing is, metaphor don't work. An alcoholic hits bottom, even if she's destroyed everything in her life, which is the only reason she's willing to consider giving up drinking. She can still start all over again, no matter how old she is. A human race, on the other hand,
Y'all wait to hit bottom to switch over to renewable energy sources. Gonna be too late. So the metaphor don't work. Well, shit. What's she gonna do now? That was her whole goddamn thesis. Well, she thinks back. She thinks way back to before she ever went on that Arctic trip, to when she first decided to make some kind of something about this subject matter when she heard a talk given by a climate scientist named Wallace Broecker. Now, this guy, Wally, he's a genuinely amiable dude, much like myself. But he's a little older. He's 79 years old. He's been studying climate science his whole entire life. This guy, Wally, coined the term global warming way back in the 1970s there. So if you can imagine for a moment that I am this human, mortal scientist, got maybe 10 more years to live, probably less. Got kids, got grandkids, got a couple of great grandkids. It's him singing, all right? So, to sum it up, I myself am an alien from outer space, dressed up in disguise as a fairly amiable dude, singing a song written by our protagonist there that she intended to be sung by a 79-year-old climate scientist named Wally. Thing is, I don't know what Wally sounds like, but I've been listening to her sing all night long, so I'm gonna sing it like she would. All right. Song's called Another 100 Years. I wish I could live another 100 years to watch the oceans rise in a world without ice, and then to see the scientists harnessing the sun and wind, lassoing CO2 like cowboys in the old Wild West. 100 years won't be enough, so I prefer 1,000.
Thanks, Cynthia. And now we'll begin the conversation if our speakers want to come up to the stage.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you to The Walker for hosting this conversation. The older I get, the less I take for granted, and I don't take for granted that you're here tonight to learn more, as we all are, this journey of discovery. My name's Paul Douglas. I'm a meteorologist, which means I'm wrong a lot. And I apologize if I screwed up a forecast for your plans in years gone by. But I'm going to make a prediction with rare 100% accuracy, which has never happened before. At some point, your kids or your grandkids will come up to you and ask you, what did you know about climate change? When? And what did you do? Did you sit on your hands? Did you kick the can down the road? Were you outspoken? Were you part of the solution? I'm a meteorologist. I don't pretend to be a climate scientist. I'm not in the same league as Peter and Pat. I'm a father of 2 boys. I have a son in the Navy who just graduated from the Naval Academy. He's learning to fly helicopters for the Navy. So we're a military family. I'm a evangelical Christian. I'm a moderate Republican. And I'm concerned about climate change, which is the greatest threat our species has ever faced, all of which makes me an albino unicorn. And I have the arrows in my back to prove it. I've been talking about this first at CCO in the late 90s. Don Shelby at one point was a skeptic. I had to sit down with him and go through the science. And now he's amazing. Sometimes I wish I could put him on mute, but he definitely gets it. For me, this had nothing to do with Al Gore, and God bless Al Gore. I appreciate his courage because I think he knew that he was going to be sticking his face in a buzzsaw. But I've been talking about this, Star Tribune, CCO for the longest time, not based on a movie, but based on what I was seeing on the weather maps. If you're a meteorologist, it's not an 8 to 5 job. You live the weather almost 24/7. And by the late 90s, I was seeing things on the weather maps that I could not explain. Of course, the weather has always been variable. We've always had cold fronts, warm fronts, big storms. But the frequency and intensity of extreme weather had increased. The analogy I gave is, imagine you're holding a remote control. It was as if Mother Nature was putting our seasons on fast forward, and she turned the volume of severe weather up to a 10. And this is starting in the late 90s. I was seeing things on the maps that made me go to the peer-reviewed science. And I gradually started educating myself about climate science. And I realized that climate theory, what people like Peter had been predicting for 20, 30 years, actually ever since 1826. This is not a new theory. This has been on the books for 175 years. But the theory had become a meteorological reality. I was seeing it every day, and I tried to connect the dots for me and for my viewers and for my readers. And I was amazed at the outcry and the pushback. A number of people who said, this is a plot, this is a scheme to make government bigger, this is a scheme to regulate industry. And I was really taken aback by that because I'm an entrepreneur, I'm a serial entrepreneur. I've started 10 companies, and I can tell you that if you don't react to data and the trends, you quickly go out of business. You become roadkill. And I was simply reacting to the data, the signal amidst the noise. There's always noise in any system. But if you look carefully, you can track the trends and the patterns. And I was seeing it every day. More intense summer rains, as Peter pointed out. Winters, not our grandfather's winter. Just the ability for snow to remain on the ground at any given time between October and March. It used to be pretty much a given, 70s and 80s. Ice on area lakes, humidity levels in the summer, things growing here that weren't growing 40, 50 years ago. I tell people, there is no one smoking gun. It's like a puzzle, and pieces of the puzzle keep falling into place. And if you step back, you can see the form emerging. And the paradox is, if we wait until the last puzzle piece pops into place, it's going to be too late to do anything. I tell my friends on both sides of the political aisle, I don't have many Republican friends left. But the truth will set me free someday. And I'm not running for anything. It's good to be skeptical. You should be skeptical. People should be skeptical. Scientists like Pat and Peter are skeptical by nature. They are some of the biggest skeptics on the planet. But being cynical in the face of overwhelming scientific evidence is disastrous and not a great way to set policy, not a great way to run a country. The problem is, this is acid rain, ozone holes, secondhand smoke times 10,000 because of the amount of money in play. Trillions and trillions of dollars on the line. As Cynthia pointed out, we're addicted. We're all addicted to carbon. We've become a planet of fossil fools. And weaning ourselves off this is not going to be easy. But I'm an optimist. I'm an entrepreneur. We have the technology. We have the entrepreneurs. Up until now, we haven't had the political will. Suddenly, this becomes a litmus test for conservatism. You can't be conservative fiscally and believe the 97% of peer-reviewed published scientists who say, pay attention, this is happening. It's ironic because Mother Nature is doing what some of the climate scientists couldn't, and that is in the last 2-3 years, which are the most severe in America's history, dating back to 1816. Mother Nature is now doing what we couldn't do, and that is convincing a majority of logical, God-fearing people that something has changed. People may not believe the scientists, they may be skeptical, but they believe their own eyes. 2011, 4 out of 5 Americans personally impacted by severe weather. 1 in 3 Americans personally injured by severe weather. You just look at the trends, and it's amazing. I'm hopeful, I'm optimistic, we have the solutions. As I tell people, there is no silver bullet. And I think that's why denial is so attractive for so many people. Psychologists say if there isn't an obvious solution, it's easier to deny. But we don't have a silver bullet, we do have silver buckshot, which collectively can start to move the needle. And I'm optimistic. Some days I'm pessimistic, but most days I'm optimistic. And one of the things that really struck me was Cynthia's work. The fact that we go out and we try to knock people over the head with a 2x4 with science. And we try to load up the statistics. Well, look at this, and look at that, and look at this, and look at this. Here's another puzzle piece. An accumulation of coincidences. And she's come along with this amazing creation, this Clement World, and is reaching people viscerally and emotionally in a way that science can't. Sometimes you pile on the science and people just build the walls of denial higher and higher. So I'm genuinely touched and impressed by what you've been able to do and the well-deserved accolades you've gotten in the press. The Walker, Minnesota's very lucky to have you here. And I'm really looking forward to your show next week. What kind of reaction have you gotten? Have you had any former skeptics come up to you and say, you know, I'm rethinking this whole thing. You touched me in an area that the science didn't reach?
I wish that I could say that happened. It hasn't happened yet, but I don't read reviews of my own. Well, I don't read any reviews really. I definitely steadfastly avoid reading reviews of my work. So
They've been good.
I don't read them.
You really should read them. They've been really good.
And I also, I'm a very shy person. I prefer dealing with people when they're in the dark in an audience and I'm on stage and light. So I feel like my way of communicating is ideal for the form in which I communicate. So I'm maybe not the person to go out and do that, but I have gotten a lot of responses that people send me emails and say that the piece, one guy said it made him have a conversation with himself, actually. And a number of people have said it made them consider their own choices in their lives in a new way. So I think that's encouraging to me.
Absolutely. Thank you. Pat, what kind of reaction do you get at the Science Museum? I mean, do you see that push-pull, that dynamic where people maybe accuse you of advocacy because you're pointing out legitimate scientific trends? How have things changed in the last couple of years?
Well, it reminds me that the Center for Climate Change Communication at George Mason University does a periodic poll of the U.S. population on this issue of climate change. And there are different categories of how people fall into this issue. There are people who are alarmed and concerned at one end, and there are people that are dismissive at the other end. But there's a lot of people in the middle that are doubtful or disengaged. It just hasn't gotten onto their radar. They're just too busy. They haven't focused on it. And so actually that's where we focus our attention, because as you pointed out, if someone is absolutely dismissive about climate change, chances are the reason isn't because of the science, but because it violates some premise that they hold much more dearly. And therefore, some opinion leader that they respect needs to reach out to them. But for a lot of other people who just haven't been that aware of the issue, we've seen a lot of opportunities to engage those audiences.
Very interesting. Peter, you have a very unique perspective as a practicing climate scientist. It seems like interest in the topic peaked in about 2006, 2007, and then when we went off the cliff with the recession, everybody rightfully concerned about the economy, jobs. You know, nothing will get in the way of the economy and righting the economy. And I get that. When you're out of work, it's not a recession, it's a depression. But what kind of feedback are you getting when you go out and you talk to lay people? Do you get pushback, or is there an acceptance on the part of most people now?
No, I get a lot of pushback, as you may be surprised at or may not be. It's somewhat based on the demographic. And what is, as Pat just said, what is the most important thing to them? So the encouraging thing to me is that I teach undergraduates at the University of Minnesota, and there is widespread understanding and acceptance of the issues related to climate change, the causes, the mechanisms. They get the science, they get the ramifications of it, and they're starting to think about these things, about what to do. And that's really something that, going back a number of years, we talk about climate change and it just wasn't on the radar of students. So that's the encouraging thing to me, is the young people coming up are thinking about this, whereas, when you're in your 40s, your 50s, and beyond, not everybody's thinking about that. And, when it hits the pocketbook, that seems to close a lot of people off. And I think the most important thing to take away from climate change, from you, as you would understand as an entrepreneur, is that there's a lot of money to be made in this problem. And there's a lot of opportunity. And, that should be a real incentive for people to be thinking about this and addressing it, rather than just shutting it off.
Right. I tell people the truth as I see it, that it's a threat and it is an opportunity. And there will be solutions. And will we be buying our solutions from China and Europe, or will they be homegrown solutions? Where is the Apple and the Google of renewable energy?
We're going to be buying our new heat engines from Trane across Wisconsin.
Really?
So, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
Way
And
to
it's going
keep
to
it
save
local.
us over $200,000 a year.
Okay.
So
And that's the other thing. Yeah, people realize too, you can go green and make green. You can do something good for the environment, and I can save money. It's a win-win kind of thing.
and employ people doing it.
Right. I don't run into too many people under the age of 30 or 35 who are skeptical. Older people, and I'm not stereotyping, but it does seem like older people are more prone to that persistent cynicism. But I'm not sure what it's going to take for some of these people. How many more Sandys, how many more droughts, how many 1 in 1,000 year rainfall events? I think we have to find ways collectively to personalize climate change, because when you look at it and you say, okay, it's a global problem, it's a slow motion transformation, it's probably one of the few things that human beings don't do well. We're sort of it's in our DNA to react to what's happening right now, today, in front of us. And here we've got this seemingly intractable problem, and yet it's not. I think that's one of the great mistakes, is that there are things we can do to mitigate the growth of CO2 and methane, and to make our cities and agriculture more resilient. And we have to start doing this. China just passed a carbon tax. I almost fell off my sofa.
Yeah, and I don't think we have to convince everyone. We don't have to convince, at the Science Museum in Minnesota, we did a survey of our visitors, and 15% of them were dismissive of climate change. Okay, we have people come to the Science Museum who don't believe in evolution. They still come to see the dinosaurs. They have a different interpretation. But those 15%, I'm not engaged in trying to convince them. It's the other 85%, and I don't think they need to be convinced. They just need to be persuaded to take a more active interest in the issue and bring it to a higher elevation, both in their personal lives and in the policy realm. We need new rules about how we govern ourselves.
Well said. Well said. How are we doing for time? Should we? Okay. Cynthia, what's next after this Clement World? Are you already daydreaming about what comes next? How on earth do you top this?
Yes. Well, I was going to say, while you were talking just now about the age of people reacting to this issue, that over the 2 years that I've been making this piece, I keep thinking the people who really need to understand this issue are people being born right now, because even in my lifetime, I mean, it's not going to be, the younger you are, the more it will affect you, basically, right? Isn't that right? And so I keep thinking I need to make a show for children. And one of the songs that I wrote for the piece is called The Tipping Point, and it's about the idea of a tipping point, and you can get to a place where it's gone too far. But it's like peppy, it sounds like a Schoolhouse Rocks song, and it's peppy and cheerful, and it's not in the show that exists now, because it's really not for this show. It's for like a children's show, and so I think it needs to be a TV show that's animated cartoons, that's like Schoolhouse Rocks, that explains various aspects of climate change in peppy songs with little creatures going around that children will enjoy, and then they can understand as young an age as possible. So that's what I'd like to. Well, one thing I'd like to do, and then I'm simultaneously making a show. I'm already making a show about the impossibility of earning a living as a performing artist.
I'll buy a ticket.
And it's a comedy show. It's a comedy. It is. It's a comedy.
It's not a tragedy. It's a comedy.
No, it's a comedy. It's a farce, and it's a series of comedic monologues that I've started creating and performing a little bit. So it's like a cross between like a Tracy Ullman or Carol Burnett show, and an Anna Devere Smith show. For those of you know who that is, she does shows about very serious subjects like the Crown Heights riots, based on interviews where she portrays these different characters. And so so those are the two things that are on the front burner right now.
I can see Sesame Street being inundated by rising sea level. I mean, that you would make your point very, very well. Very cool. Yeah, growing up, my father, he said, once you have all the information, the decision is easy. And he also said that actions have consequences. And this is something I try to explain to my dwindling number of conservative friends. You know, you can't keep pumping trillions of tons of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and just pretend that it's not going to come back to bite us. And it's biting us now in a number of areas, including the weather with these extremes that Peter noticed. I've noticed this too, that the weather gets stuck in a way that it didn't get stuck when I got here back in the early 80s. And we're seeing more of these black swan events. These, you know, you shouldn't get 4 1 in 1,000 year floods in 8 years. I'm not a statistician, but that just does not add up.
If you ran into those odds at a casino, you'd run out the door.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But the other thing I mentioned too is that there are nearly 1,000 references in the Bible to caring for God's creation. You know, God was pretty adamant about that. He calls us to be stewards, and we are accountable for our stewardship. We are passing through. We're supposed to hand on the earth to future generations in as good a shape as we found it, preferably better. And I just hope that some of the people that are the perennial skeptics and cynics, you know, maybe there is a way, this notion of creation care, caring for God's, you know, you're living in God's home, and He's going to be pretty upset if you don't take care of it. I don't know. You know, I think we have to try everything to reach people, and different people are going to respond to different initiatives.
Well, I think the 15% that are dismissive have been very effective in being vocal about their skepticism, and I don't think we're going to convince them. What I'd like to see is just they go off and argue amongst themselves. Let us get going on the solutions, and they can continue to coalesce and argue amongst themselves.
And some of the same pseudoscientists that came out in the 70s before Congress and testified that you can't prove that smoking 3 packs a day of cigarettes triggered lung cancer. And there was a time in the mid-70s when a lot of people sat back and said, you know, maybe there isn't enough science, maybe there isn't enough data. You know, the tobacco companies were very effective at trotting out these well-paid consultants to initiate doubt, to plant these seeds of doubt. And right now we have tens of millions of dollars in the system funding these denier websites, these institutes. There are dozens of them, and they are sowing confusion. They're doing everything they can to push back that day of reckoning. And that day of reckoning is coming, and it's younger voters, I think, who ultimately, if you have an anti-science congressman, and this is just my personal opinion, if you have somebody who has a disdain for the scientific method, they should not be representing my district. I now have 2 Republican friends left. If you're getting your science information from cable news or from blogs, you're going to be woefully underinformed. But it's what's challenging about this, and maybe you have some suggestions. This is hard even for meteorologists, because we're fixated on weather, you know, the next 7 days, and people say, well, your computer models can't even get the 7-day right. Why should we believe you looking out 20, 30, 40 years? And meteorologists want to be loved. The whole ratings thing, you know, it's real. I mean, whether you get renewed as a local TV talent depends on your Q scores, how many people know you, and the people who know you, do they like you? And if you go on the air and start talking about climate change, you know you're going to piss off, right off the bat, 20%, maybe 25% of the viewers. So the news director may have a problem with that. Why are you pissing off a quarter of our potential viewers? It's science. It's happening. I'm connecting the dots. Well, so this is what, not defending TV meteorologists, but this is what they're up against. You know, in a world of popularity contests, when you start talking about the truth and some unpleasant truths, you know, you can almost hear people clicking off their TVs. So there's some real challenges there, and I'd be curious how do you keep that global perspective? Because people look out the window every time it snows, and I'll get a few emails. Paul, where's your climate change now?
Well, Paul, you may not be able to predict the weather 10 days from now, but you can predict the climate of June, that it'll be warmer than February, and that's a climatological prediction, not a meteorological one.
Right.
And so we're making climatological predictions in the future, not weather predictions, these climatological predictions are based on bigger processes in motion than the day-to-day variation in the weather, in the atmosphere.
And it may have been warmer tens, hundreds of millions of years ago, but that's when the planet was engulfed in volcanoes, right?
Yeah, I mean,
planetary volcanoes.
You got to look at the atmospheric chemistry. You got to look at the orbit of the planet. You have to look at a lot of factors to look at why the climate was different millions of years ago than it is today. We do have analogies, though. Paleoclimatology, that whole field is very, very important because what it allows us to do is look for analogs in the past history when we had high levels of CO2 in the atmosphere and why the climate, how the climate responded, how the vegetation responded, what it did to the biota. It's very, very important. And I do think it's important. One comment is, what I tell my undergraduates is you can forecast out about 5 days and have a reasonably good forecast. 3 to 5 days is pretty solid in meteorology from our numerical models. We can also handle about 10 years to 100 to 200 years with our climate models in terms of prediction of how the climate is going to respond. Where we have the gap is from 5 days or 7 days to 10 years. That's the hard part in modeling, and there's a reason for why it's difficult. But as Pat was saying, we have far more confidence in a decadal or a 20 or 50-year forecast of what the climate is going to be like than we do 14 days out.
That's very interesting.
And there were times, you're right, Paul, in the paleontological past when it was much warmer on the planet, but there weren't people there. And we're talking about a very rapid change in climate in a very short period of time that really has no geologic precedence. So we are really talking about a very unique change of conditions. And I've mentioned, that 63 million years ago, an object from space slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula and brought the dinosaurs to an end. And if we looked into a telescope tomorrow and saw an object coming toward the Earth, we wouldn't say, well, that's natural. It's happened before. Earth has survived. No big deal. So the future's in our hands, so let's be adults about it and plan for the future that we want.
Very good point. Thank you. Now, we want to take some of your questions now. We appreciate your patience. Yes, sir. They're going to bring the microphone down. This gentleman right here.
But we're on the web.
Oh, we're on the web. Yep. We're streaming on the web, so we want to try to get you on the mic.
No, I was just intrigued by your comment about the mechanisms of denial, that there are a lot of different kinds of science involved in this, and being originally a political scientist, I sort of gravitate toward that. I mean, what is the nature of the people who are not seeing the evidence, and how can we reach them? And that I know that Earl Joseph in the Minnesota Futurist used to say that understanding the mechanisms of denial were critical in doing any kind of science. But one of my favorite quotes along this, I think it was Lord Macaulay in the 19th century, who made the comment well before this issue ever reared its head, that if a big enough commercial interest were threatened, Newton's law of gravity would be questioned. And I think that's kind of the paradigm that I look at. How would you, does that sync with what we're talking about, do you think?
I think it does sync, and the reason there's so much denial and so much pushback is because there's so much money at stake. Bill McKibben had a great article recently in Rolling Stone talking about the amount of carbon that's still in the ground and how much of it we can extract without going above 2 degrees C, which, most scientists believe we need to try to stay below that 2 degrees C. I think it comes down to regulation. It comes down to people on the far right being concerned about government getting bigger. Is this an excuse to grow government? Me being an entrepreneur, I see the opportunities for small and medium and large business people. I see the market. I don't think this is going to be a top-down solution. I think most of the solutions are going to be from the bottom up. We have to find a way to put a price on carbon. There has to be. Carbon is a pollutant, just like chlorofluorocarbons with the ozone hole. We found a way. The Republicans came out with a version of cap and trade for acid rain. So there is precedent. Once we put a price on carbon, I'm naively optimistic that the markets can come up with solutions. The best solutions may not be dictated by government. I think we need to let the thing that America does best is innovate. And when I say, what is the Apple, what is the Google for battery technology and for next generation solar, where we all have solar on our rooftops because it's so cheap, why on earth wouldn't you do it? And I think we're going to get there, but we have to let competition lower prices, increase quality, and let the markets do what the markets do best. But government has a role in this, and that is to set a price on an obvious pollutant. And it may happen vis-a-vis the Clean Air Act and the EPA if Congress doesn't act. We're going to figure this out because we're not going to have a choice. What I don't know is what it's going to take to really come up with a political solution that moves the ball forward. I don't know. Do you have any words of wisdom from your vantage point about the log jam in Washington and what's going to happen?
I have an idea.
What?
But it's totally outlandish, and it's just an idea to.
That might work.
It just is an idea to make you feel like like I'm speaking way out of my league here. But what was stunning to me, not having any involvement in the world of finance or politics, that overnight, when the financial crisis happened, in some little room somewhere, some guy said, you have to come up with this money, like overnight, right?
Right.
Or the banks will,
Seize
it's
up.
going to be a catastrophe,
Right. Armageddon.
And they're like, okay. So I just think, and it's like Buckminster Fuller said, it's there. It's not a matter of it's not there. It's a matter of, is the need, is the right guy saying we need it? So I'm just saying, could you have an actor trained, almost like a stealth CIA agent, infiltrating the world of high finance? And everyone believes him, everyone knows. And so he gets to the point of being so high up in the ranks that he can go in there and say, look, we need you to take all the money that is now going into fracking and deep sea drilling and the tar sands, and we need all of that money and all of the fossil fuel companies. We need to take them. They need to switch. They need to switch all that money overnight we need it, we're talking, or there's going to be a world collapse, and I'm telling you, 'cause I'm the guy that holds the strings, you know, and he's been planted in there for, this might take a while, because first you've got to train him. It's like a James Bond type of...
Wait, you're talking, it's the Manchurian Candidate, right?
It is the Manchurian Candidate, that's
Only
right.
the green Manchurian Candidate.
That's right, the green Manchurian Candidate. That's
Okay.
right. And maybe that's the movie, maybe that's the Hollywood movie that needs to get made, right, about it, because that would be pretty exciting. And
Where
then
does he get
goes in there,
trained?
and they're like, okay, we're gonna take it, we're gonna give every building in I don't know, the world, or you could just make it Wisconsin or something. It doesn't have, if it's a Hollywood movie, right, it has to be at least the United States of America, you know, it has to be. And there, solar panels on, you know, everything's going, all the buildings are going green, you know, overnight, because the guy says that's what has to happen. And everybody says, okay.
It's funny you say that. Thank you, yeah. Well said. I think Republicans will come around when they realize that they're missing money on the table. It's like, wait a second. We need to be part of this when there's a sense of urgency. Richard Branson, you know what he said about climate change? He said, the companies that figure this out will not only be the richest people on the planet, but the richest people that ever lived. I mean, if that is an incentive...
I have one other idea, which is the Longitude. Did anybody read this book, Longitude? You know, they had this contest, and they said, we're going to give, you know, some, whatever it was at that time, a fortune, you know, to the guy who comes forward and says, here's what you do to solve this problem. I don't know. That's not as exciting of an idea.
I like your Manchurian Candidate thing.
Well, we got 50 states in the United States, and each one of them can experiment the way it wants. So how about we be the state that believes in physics, in thermodynamics, and climate change,
Contest.
and let's start innovating.
Energy Alley.
Yeah,
Wait, I have one other idea, though. I have one other idea.
more than that.
But really, it's just that I'm just thinking about, like, the popularity contest that is politics, at least in the United States, which is so, you know, like waters down someone like Obama. It's like the major, like Martin Luther King. There's a reason he got assassinated. You know what I mean? It's like you have to do something. We need somebody who's going to be a leader in this, who is willing to be totally unpopular and hated, and maybe assassinated. Or like Lincoln, also assassinated. You know, that's another reason why he was assassinated too. So we need somebody who's going to be willing to
volunteer for this, not knowing what is.
And either be
how
the
the show
president,
ends.
become the president, or lead a grassroots organization like the Civil Rights Movement, who's a preacher and not a politician, who's going to be our champion. It's not going to. Yeah, it should be a preacher, definitely preacher.
But to get assassinated for your cause is a very Jesus thing to do.
Yeah, sure, yeah. Let's get a Christian.
You're in charge.
Hello. It won't be arrows, Doug.
Jeez.
It has to be someone with really excellent speaking skills, though. Like Martin Luther King, you listen to him, you're like, sign me up. Sign me up.
Okay, look at the time. Yes. Yes, you, young lady in the front. Yep.
Here it comes.
So as you were saying before, with like having the government and a lot of the companies be involved with this, the thing is that like a couple years, not just a couple years ago, earlier in the 2000s, there was the electric car. That was a viable thing that was available to public readily. But it was the EV2 and EV1, I think. But the thing is that the government, the oil companies are so, I guess, like infused into our government that they were able to like easily control what our government condoned as okay to be on the roads. And because of that, the government actually shut down the EV program. What do you think it will take for the government and the oil companies to actually start not thinking about their profits and not thinking about the detriments of not having the oil companies on their side, what do you think it will take for them to stop? Oh gosh, I'm nervous. What do you think will
No,
it take
I
for
understand.
them
I
to
think
change that and actually go out on a limb and say, okay, this needs to be done and it needs to be done now. We can't just go on turning off the lights or taking shorter showers. We can't just do all these like little things. We need to do those and bigger things. What do you think it will take for them to actually start advocating for that?
It's going to take a social movement that will rival and possibly surpass the civil rights movement. It will be a global movement, and it will be mostly made up of people under the age of 35 who have the ultimate power, and that is the power to vote your representatives out and get people in who you believe in and who represent the kind of future you want to live in. So, I mean, we still have representative democracy in this country. We're not stuck with the bums we have today. And, you know, you still have power.
And, you know, there's a lot of companies out there that I think increasingly are not content to let oil companies dictate what we should be thinking about this issue, because it's getting too expensive for insurance companies and other kinds of companies to sit on the sidelines and not be involved in this discussion. So I think that we need to put more weight on our side of the scale. And there's political elements to that, but it's also, I think, encouraging a state like ours that has no coal, oil, natural gas, uranium. We import all of our energy to be innovative. And I think there's a lot of companies that would like to see that initiative, who are dismayed by the current lack of progress on this issue. And I think we can get pushback. Right now, I think for a number of years, I think fossil fuel industries have had free run of the field. And we need to get more players on the field, more pushback.
My father-in-law worked for Exxon, so you can only imagine the conversations we had before he died of cancer, because he was involved with the refineries. And we don't know for sure, but we think that just being around the refineries and all those exotic chemicals killed him. But, you know, we can't turn off fossil fuels overnight. And I'm at least encouraged that, although the whole fracking thing to me is still something of a riddle, the amount of water that's necessary, the carcinogens we're pumping into the ground, and the methane. Oh, I have some friends who monitor methane emissions around the country. And I mean, you can actually see it on the satellite photos, burning off the methane in North Dakota. It shows up on the weather satellites. There's that much. So I don't think we know really. I want to believe, like everybody, that it's cleaner and better, and it sounds good, energy independence. But I still think, it's the 21st century, why are we relying on 19th century extraction? Really? We need that to keep the lights on? We can't figure out other ways to power our economy that don't come back to bite us, you know, down the road? I'm a naive optimist, and I think everybody up here is a naive optimist. We'll come up with solutions, but you know what Churchill said? You can count on Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else. And that seems to be par for the course. You know, we'll get there. Yeah.
So you guys had the elephant up, the white elephant in the room, and I wonder, like, do you think we can go to 9 billion people on the planet and actually, and somehow, like, not cook ourselves, I guess is the question. And we've got a fellow here from Minneapolis named Alan Weissman, who wrote a book, The World Without Us, that kind of outlined a prescription of how we might save ourselves. And I wonder if you guys might just comment on that idea of, can we go to 9 billion people and not incinerate ourselves in the process?
Well, I think that we're going to have to go to 9 billion people, because that's the trajectory. And so I think those people will want to live a life just like we all want to live a life. And Also, I think when it comes to climate change, the vast majority of the fossil fuels being burned on this planet are being burned by a very small percentage of the people on this planet. So about 80% of the emissions are being generated by 20% of the people on this planet. That includes me, and probably most of us in the room. So I think the issue about getting to 9 billion without cooking ourselves is how that 20% behaves themselves over the next 30 years as we move toward 9 billion. We have to figure out a way. And I'm confident that there actually are ways. I think that we grow enough food on this planet right now for 9 billion people. We just don't use most of it for feeding people. So I'm actually confident about being able to have a planet with 9 billion people. We just can't do that the way we are right now. That's the rub. We're trying to run a planet of 7 billion people with 9 billion predicted, and we want to keep doing it the same way we have for the last 100 years. And what we're seeing is that that's just not possible. And right now, the logjam is what it has to be, because that's the way we've been doing it for 100 years. And the argument is, but it's not going to work, but we have to, because that's the way we've done it for 100 years. So right now, we're in this paradigm shift, but hasn't quite shifted yet. But I think we can live with 9 billion people on this planet, because we're going to have to. We're all going to have to.
And we also
switch in.
Much of the planet is inheriting our propensity for living in a disposable, consumption-based society. So I think it ultimately comes down to what makes people happy. I mean, everybody, all of us want the same things for our kids. We all want to do better. But
well, and I think you mentioned the new technologies and the new opportunities, the new business opportunities, and they are enormous. I grew up with incandescent light bulbs, then went to compact fluorescence, and now in a few years, I'm confident my house will have LEDs. So that's an incredible reduction in the amount of energy to do a basic thing, which is to generate light. And in the vast majority of the world where people don't have access to electricity or light, they're not going to go incandescent bulbs to compact fluorescence to LEDs. They're going to go straight to LEDs, the most efficient lighting source that we've ever invented on this planet. And they're going to have a cell phone, but it's not going to require thousands of miles of copper cable running across a continent in order to do it. There'll be a few satellites in space, a few solar panels on homes. So we are going to leapfrog technologies that are going to allow people to live much better than they do now, with much less material requirements than we've been accustomed to living with.
A lighter footprint.
Much lighter footprint. Right. We'll be able to dance.
Well, some of us. Okay. Paul, last question.
Not a question, but a comment. Cynthia, you mentioned Buckminster Fuller. And I had the opportunity to meet him before he passed away at the University of Minnesota. And one of the things that he said is to have this paradigm shift, it doesn't take everyone, as we've been mentioning. But he actually said that if 6% of the population fully embraces an idea, that will draw in the 14 to 18% needed to actually make a movement that has a force of its own. So I think we are the 6%, right? So go do your work and come and see me if you want to find out what to do.
Well said. Well said. Thank you, everybody. Many of us are going to be out in the lobby afterwards. So if you didn't have a chance to ask your question and you've got a burning question, comment, or threat, please see Peter, Pat, or Cynthia. It's past my bedtime, but thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you. And I just wanted to remind everybody again, get your tickets. This Clement World next week, March 7th through 9th. Thank you.
Yes.
All of you. It was great.